Welcome to High Growth Matters, an OpenComp podcast for influential players in the pre-IPO ecosystem. This show shares insider knowledge about building a badass business, and the expert conversation you're about to hear will cover everything you need to know about hiring and retention, fundraising, leadership, diversity, and more. Let's get to it. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the official High Growth Matters podcast. My name is Caitlin Allen. I am the VP of Marketing at OpenComp, and I'm one of your co-hosts, your only co-host today. Welcome to today's episode. So let's get right to it. When we think about compensation, most of us, we think about something that's super complicated. But if there is one thing that I've learned from working with Kyle Murphy, who is our guest today, it is that that doesn't have to be. Compensation can actually be very simple. So today we are going to talk about the most common misconceptions that he sees across OpenComp's customer base of thousands of organizations as they're working together to have clarity at every point of decision as it relates to pay. A little bit about Kyle. He leads customer advocacy at OpenComp, and he draws from his experience in both compensation and customer success worlds at companies like PayScale and MedBridge. Kyle, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
So let's start with something personal so folks can get to know you a little bit. What is something that people generally don't know about you?
Yeah. Well, you might be able to tell this if you're a musical theater fan and you're looking at my back wall. But I'm a huge musical theater fan to the point that I actually opened up a small community theater in my local community of Olympia and built a black box theater in the mall to make available for local groups who didn't really have a place to perform. So my partner Danielle and I take 1 to 2 trips a year to New York specifically to watch Broadway shows, and it's a huge passion for me. Something people often don't guess when they meet me.
It is not something I would have guessed, but I would like to be one of the guests on your biannual trips.
It's a lot of fun.
I bet it is. I don't believe in going to New York unless you go to Broadway while you're there. So let's get into the topic at hand today. We're here to talk about common compensation misconceptions. And so let's dive into what some of those are. And maybe as a preamble, before we get into it, why this matters, from my perspective, for HR leaders who are our listeners are HR leaders, it matters because comp is the biggest source of spend for any company. It's also it has a big impact on culture and productivity, employer brand, and just any number of things. So I wanted to paint the stage there that this is a really important topic you're about to drop some wisdom on today. And misconception number one that you've shared with me is that companies believe they should ask, what are other companies doing to figure out their remote work strategy? Why is that a misconception?
Yeah, that's a big one. And it's kind of funny because I worked in compensation from 2014 to 2017. And then I took a few years off and I came back, and really nothing had changed in how compensation was managed, except this one thing, that we have this remote world now. And everybody I talk to asks, what should we do? What are other companies doing about remote work strategies? And the answer that I give them truthfully is asking me what other companies are doing for remote work strategies. It's everybody's scrambling to try and figure out what their neighbor is doing and how people are solving this problem. But really, you shouldn't be looking at what other companies are doing. You should be looking inward, because the answer to that question really comes down to, are your jobs going to people who want to work exclusively from home and can do them from anywhere and are going for the highest dollar? Because if so, then you really need to think about those top tier markets and targeting those when you're doing your compensation. But if your job need to be done in an office, if even part of the time, once a week, a couple times a week, so you're anchored to a geographic location, or if you have any sort of mission-driven element to your company. If you are, say, a software company that helps physical therapists connect with elderly patients when they can't make it into the office, you may be attracting talent for a lot of jobs that isn't necessarily concerned about getting the biggest paycheck. And you can focus more on a strategy that looks at, say, where they're living, the cost of living, the cost of labor in their specific geographic market. So it's more about knowing your DNA and why people work for you than knowing what others are doing, especially once you get past those jobs that are just kind of anchoring to the biggest paycheck.
And that actually is a very insightful comment. If people are starting with the what should I do or how should I have a remote work strategy, they haven't taken the time to ask that question of why have one and what makes me different. So therefore answering the question of why should our strategy, like what should its guiding principles be, so to speak. So that makes total sense. The second misconception that we discussed in our prep call, Kyle, as you remember, is the idea that companies believe they'll attract the best talent if they target the top market pay percentile, meaning, oh, I need to pay at 75% of market or 100% of market. So when is it savvy, or is it ever savvy, not to target the top of the market?
Yeah, absolutely. There are lots of situations when it's savvy to not target the top of the market. I mean, like the top of the market, only a few people can be there. There's this whole other section of the workforce that isn't, expected to be paid at the 90th percentile. And you can encounter those situations where you don't necessarily need to focus on targeting that top percentile. Like if you have an early entry job where you're going to recruit a lot of people who are looking to gain skills and then move up to other places in the organizations, you don't necessarily need to target the 75th percentile to get good talent for that. When you have mission-driven roles and people want to work for you because of who you are and what you're doing and who you're serving, those are not the same people looking for that top paycheck. They just want to be paid fairly. Well, there's a huge range of paid fairly that isn't at the top of the market that people are willing to accept. Additionally, you look at the individual perks that come with working with your organization. Whether it could be something as simple as a bring your pet to work policy, or a policy that every parent gets to pick their kid up from school. Or a coffee machine that's state of the art that that your employees love. There are reasons that people work for organizations that aren't strictly market driven, and you really have to look at the bigger picture of what you're offering as an employment package and an incentive for someone to show up every day. And compensation is a huge piece of that, but it's only one piece.
Right. Compensation is a piece of total rewards, but it's not the total. That's a really good point. And I think that, to me, is a somewhat relieving piece of truth to hear during times of economic uncertainty where budgets are under greater scrutiny. They might have greater limitations. And so that's a good piece of news to be able to share with our listeners. I also think that, in my experience, I've seen that it really depends. How a company pays depends upon where they are in their company life cycle as well. Early on, you might really want to pay at a top percentile for engineers, for instance, because you're building the product, you're trying to get an MVP. But then maybe further on in the company life cycle, when you've raised a Series C or D round, maybe you're focused more around go-to-market roles or hiring top executives. And so it really is reflective of where your company is at, and the compensation philosophy, strategy and philosophy that go into to making those decisions.
Absolutely. I mean, if you're running a data software company, you need data scientists, and that's the core of what makes your product successful. You're going to have to target the top of the market. As you grow, that may change.
Yeah, no, it's so true. So number 3, at least in my experience, is the one that I see the most in terms of a misconception. And it's the belief that pay bands or salary ranges and market percentiles are the same thing. So I'm going to ask you what the difference is, but maybe we should even define what both are as part of our understanding that difference.
Yeah, and this is hands down it is the most common misconception that I work through when folks are getting into compensation data for the first time. A market percentile is a data point. If we think back to like standardized testing in school, if you scored at the 99th percentile, it means you scored higher than 99% of people who took that test. Compensation market percentiles are no different. And we often focus on numbers like the 25th percentile, the 50th percentile, and the 75th percentile. And it's very tempting for folks to want to make that a pay range and say, well, we're going to pay between the 25th and the 75th. The problem is if all your data points are clustered tightly together, like let's say every data point have is between $98,000 and $102,000, then that's where the 25th and the 75th percentiles lie too. And your range is like this small, or it could be this big if they're spread out. So what we do to work with that and make it so that raw data is not impacting us in that way is we create pay ranges where we say we want to target most of our employees right around, say, the 50th percentile. We'll go and we'll find out what that 50th percentile is, and then we're going to build a range on either side of it. Let's say 15% is a best practice. So if you find that the 50th percentile for the job you're benchmarking is $100,000, then your pay range might be $85,000 to $115,000. And the reason that's important is because market data fluctuates all the time. There are anomalies, like we just talked about. You can get market data that's tightly clustered or spread out. And when you build a range structure, that is built off your organization's compensation philosophy and compensation strategy. So when you evaluate your workforce to it, or when you update it, you're not just evaluating how you're performing to the market. You're evaluating how you're performing to your strategy, and that's really what we care about.
That makes a lot of sense. And I think that is a very important nuance for companies to understand and HR leaders to understand on their company's behalf, in light of the fact that New York pay transparency legislation is going to come into effect less than a month now on November 1st of 2022. And as of a week and a half ago, Gavin Newsom signed new pay transparency legislation into effect as well, January 1 in California, where pay ranges will have to be listed in job posts by that start date. So that's an important one to really get. Number 4 of 5 is the misconception is that businesses must personalize market data to their organizations. So maybe could you explain what that is for our listeners who may not know it, and then describe why they don't always have to do that?
Sure. So what we're talking about here is the perception that I need to make sure all data that I look at is specific to exactly what my organization looks like. And while there's truth that you want to think about things that way, and that is impactful, because if you get data that's not representative of, I guess, the sandbox you're playing in, so to speak, you're not going to be able to get good data. But at the same time, I find that a lot of times people anchoring on, I have to find the specific one set of data sources that is right for me, and that will be my source of truth, and I will never look past it. And in reality, the best practice for compensation is to look at multiple data sources. There are a variety of reasons for this, both to avoid data anomalies, but also what it allows you to do is, we need to pause here because I've lost track of what I was saying.
No problem. I can ask the question over again because that's probably just the easiest. I basically was asking about personalizing market data and why they don't have to personalize market data.
I'm trying to remember the thought train I was going on with this, because it's about, so people get anchored to one data source, but the truth is, again, this goes back to market data versus ranges. If I just jump in here, can you cut it?
Yeah.
Okay. So it goes back to what we were talking about with market data versus ranges. You should be acquiring market data to build strategic ranges. And those ranges, they're not based on whether you found that a customer success manager in Illinois is making $68,493.21. It's rounded so that you can manage multiple positions that provide like value to the organization at the same time, save yourself time, and then have internal equity. So if you're anchored to one data point and you think it has to be exactly what your organization looks like, that's just not true. Additionally, what if you are not competing for talent with people who look like you? What if you need engineers that will compete for jobs at Fang? What if you're a large company, but you can actually hire talent that would be applying for jobs at small startups because of the nature of that job? It's more important to understand what the competitive marketplace looks like and what your competitive set is for each job than it is to find data that looks exactly like you.
And that makes a lot of sense because that is the reality of today's world. So closing out with misconception number 5, Kyle, I think I would wager a bet that most managers at some point in time, particularly in the last couple of years, given how fast the labor market has been moving from a pay perspective, have heard from an employee on their team or from a peer at the very least, where the employees come to them and said, hey, I got hired, however many X number of months ago, and you hired me at 50th percent of market rate, and now it's 6 months later, and I realized I'm now at 30th percentile. I need a raise or something along those lines. And so the misconception is that the companies sometimes respond with is that they need to anchor to compensation data in real time as it shifts. So in that scenario, the manager would then say to that team member, oh, okay, well, we clearly need to give you a raise so that we can stay true to our compensation philosophy. Why is this not a best practice?
Oh, so many reasons. And where this comes from actually is the way compensation used to be done, which created a huge time gap from the time it was collected until the time it was distributed, sometimes like a year and a half. So as technology has allowed us to get more nimble, there has been this rally cry for real-time data, because that's kind of how big data thinks is give us all the data, we can give you information that just came in yesterday. And there's a million reasons why you don't want to do that in compensation. All you have to do right now to get an idea of that is look at the exchange rate with the British pound over the last week. It's gone up and down 10%. It's all over the place. And if you tried to make adjustments to your workforce based on that exchange rate as it fluctuates, you would be having meetings on a daily basis. It would just be impossible. So you want to get kind of like blended snapshots in time to see trends, where things are going, as opposed to trying to get real-time data. I think that trying to get refreshes once every 6 months, possibly once every 3 months, is good, but you don't want to overreact. There were a lot of companies that just got their funding and were very excited and overpaid for a lot of employees in Q1 and Q2 of this year when things were just going gangbusters. And then all of a sudden they looked around and the employment marketplace wasn't as hot as it was a couple months ago because everyone just went through layoffs. And so if you're trying to anchor to the most real-time data, then you were probably paying at the 99th percentile today.
Yeah.
So it's important to understand that, yes, fresh data is important, but that doesn't mean you want real-time data, or that data that's coming in on a daily basis is necessarily more valid or valuable to you than something that's been captured over a period of time.
I've heard it said that updating ranges about once a year is best practice, meaning that you take compensation data that's fairly fresh at that point and then update your company's pay ranges on an annual cycle. Is that correct?
That is a best practice. Yes, that is a best practice. I would say some companies look at doing it once every 2 years. Those tend to be in high growth mode. They tend to have a lot of change within their workforce, typically even people changing responsibilities within the organization. But if you're going to do a comp review once every 6 months, know why you're doing it. Don't just do it because you heard it was a best practice. Understand what you're trying to accomplish and what you hope things look like when you're done. Otherwise, it's just like it's a lot of wheel spinning.
Makes a lot of sense. Well, Kyle, you have dropped some major wisdom in this call, so thank you so much. As we close out, keep in mind we're talking to HR leaders as our listeners. What would you say is the most important thing that you've said today that our listeners should remember and take action on?
Well, all of this really rolls back to understand your business and how it relates to the marketplace, because every single answer I gave could be interpreted differently depending on where you are in your life cycle, how large you are, how big your team is, how many things you have to think about. But it all comes down to knowing who you are, understanding, making sure you have a defined compensation philosophy and strategy, and that you are putting that into place so you're not just reactive to what the market says. That's really what it comes down to, is know your organization and let that really drive your compensation practices.
I love it. Makes so much sense. Kyle, thank you so much for being here today and for everything you've shared with us.
Thank you, Caitlin. I enjoyed it.
Win top talent while strengthening runway with OpenComp. Thousands of the world's fastest growing companies use our compensation intelligence platform because it offers the most competitive benchmarks and insights available. To learn more, visit app.opencomp.com/signup.